A cold dawn breaks over the royal city. Mist drifts above the cobblestone streets, curling around marble pillars and gilded rooftops. The palace walls catch the first light of morning, glowing faintly like sheets of silver. Within those walls life stirs, servants rushing through echoing corridors, footsteps blending with the rustle of silk and the clatter of bronze trays. Among them moves Ilara, a quiet young maid no one seems to notice. Her hands are red and rough from endless scrubbing, her dress plain and faded from washing, yet there is a grace in her movements, a quiet rhythm that belongs only to her. As she polishes the marble floors of the grand hall, she hums under her breath, barely audible above the noise of work. Her song is soft, but it carries a tender thread of sound winding through the morning air. The melody seems to awaken something in the walls themselves, filling the cold corridors with warmth. It is not the voice of a servant, but of a dreamer, light, clear, and pure as water over glass. But dreams are not welcome here. Stop singing, Ilara. This isn't a concert hall, one of the senior maids snaps, her voice sharp as the broom she holds. Another laughs quietly, whispering, "She thinks she's a princess." Ilara lowers her gaze. The faint smile on her lips trembles but does not fade. She murmurs a quiet apology and continues her work, her song swallowed by the noise around her, yet inside her chest, the melody still burns, small, stubborn, and alive. For every note she hums is a piece of her hope, a whisper of the life she longs for beyond these palace walls, a life where her voice is not mocked but heard, where she can sing beneath open skies instead of within stone chambers. Outside, the city begins to wake, vendors calling, carriages rolling, bells tolling from distant towers. But in one small corner of the grandest palace, a nameless maid dares to dream. The palace was a place of whispers, whispers that floated through hallways like drifting feathers, carrying secrets, laughter, and judgment. And now one whisper carried a name, Ilara. Her gentle humming, once confined to the servants' quarters, had reached the marble corridors and gilded chambers. The nobles, wrapped in silk and pride, heard her voice during their morning walks and chuckled behind jeweled fans. "The singing maid," they murmured. "How quaint. She must think she's special," another laughed, her pearls gleaming in the sun. Soon her melody became gossip, a small, harmless tune twisted into mockery. Even the head housekeeper, a stern woman with eyes sharp as glass, took notice. One afternoon she pulled Ilara aside, her expression cold. "The queen dislikes noise," she warned in a low voice. "Do your job, girl. You're a servant, not a songbird." Ilara bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. But that night, when the palace fell silent and the moonlight spilled silver over the gardens, Ilara slipped quietly through the courtyard gates. Barefoot, she walked across the dew-drenched grass until she reached the old marble fountain. There she stood alone under the open sky and sang. Her voice rose like a prayer, soft at first, then stronger, braver. It was a song of longing and freedom, of dreams too big for her world, too fragile for her station. The wind caught her notes and carried them over the palace walls, scattering them into the sleeping city beyond. For those few stolen minutes, she was no longer a maid. She was a soul unchained, a melody alive beneath the moon. But destiny listens to every secret. That night, 2 palace guards, bored from their rounds, heard her singing. They followed the sound and found her by the fountain, her face lifted to the stars. "Well, well," one sneered. "The little maid thinks she's performing for the heavens." They laughed cruelly, their mockery echoing louder than her song. Before dawn, they forced her to scrub the entire courtyard, the cold water biting her hands, her knees raw against the stone. Yet as she worked, tears glistening in her eyes, a soft hum rose once more from her lips, quiet, defiant, unbroken. Her music, her only friend that would not be silenced. Beyond the laughter and gossip of the palace halls, in a high chamber draped with velvet and silence, sat the queen. She was beautiful, the kind of beauty that once drew poets and painters from faraway lands. But now, that beauty was like a flower pressed in an old book, untouched, unmoving, and forgotten by time. Her days passed quietly beside the tall arched window that overlooked the royal gardens. From there she watched the world in stillness, the changing colors of dawn, the play of light upon marble, the distant hum of life she no longer joined. There had been a time when music filled her world, when the sound of harps and flutes drifted through every corridor. She had loved songs then, especially lullabies. But that was before the sickness came, before the laughter of her only child was taken away. Since that day, silence became her refuge and her prison. The royal musicians still came every evening, tuning their instruments with trembling hands. They played their finest pieces before her, hoping for even the faintest smile. But her gaze never lifted. Her lips never parted. Their music, though flawless, fell flat against the walls like echoes from a dream long gone. The courtiers whispered behind her back, "The queen's heart has turned to stone." Not even the angels could make her weep again. Yet behind that mask of cold grace was a woman drowning in her own memories. Sometimes late at night, she would wake from dreams of her child's laughter and press her palm against her chest, as if trying to hold on to the echo before it vanished. And though no one dared to speak of it, the palace had grown colder with her grief. Servants moved in hushed tones. The halls no longer rang with music or joy. Even the air seemed afraid to disturb her sorrow. But destiny has strange ways of weaving broken hearts together. For in the same palace where a queen mourned her silence, a forgotten maid named Ilara sang softly to the moon, her melody pure, untouched by fame or fear. Two souls, one bound by grief, the other by chains of servitude, both longing for the same thing, a song that could heal what silence never could. The day the storm came, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Dark clouds rolled across the royal city, their heavy shadows swallowing the gardens in gloom. Rain began to fall, first as a whisper, then as a steady rhythm against stone and glass. Servants hurried about, gathering linens and shutting windows before the downpour flooded the marble courtyards. No one expected the queen to appear. She rarely left her chambers, especially on days like this. But that afternoon, cloaked in deep blue velvet and sorrow, she descended the grand staircase and walked into the garden. The servants gasped and bowed low, scrambling to clear her path. The rustle of fabric, the clatter of buckets, everything became a hurried blur of fear and reverence. The queen's steps were slow, measured, her face unreadable beneath the soft veil of rain. A few steps away, Ilara knelt beside a line of laundry, soaked sheets clinging to her arms as she tried to gather them before the wind tore them away. She did not see the queen. She only knew the sound of rain, the cool touch of water on her face, and the weight of her own thoughts, and so she did what she always did when the world grew heavy. She hummed. The melody rose gently, fragile yet fearless, threading through the storm like a silver ribbon. Her voice blended with the rain, soft and haunting, carrying an ache too old for her years. The queen stopped. Her guards froze beside her, confused. That voice, it pierced through the dull roar of the storm, through the walls she had built around her heart. It was not perfect. It was raw, honest, alive. One of the guards stepped forward, ready to scold the maid for her insolence, but the queen raised a hand. "Let her finish," she said quietly. Ilara's heart nearly stopped. She turned, and there, through the curtain of rain, stood the queen herself, watching. Her hands trembled. Her voice faltered for a breath. Then she closed her eyes and kept singing. The courtyard fell silent except for her song in the rain. When she finished, Ilara bowed deeply, her knees touching the wet stone. The queen said nothing. She only turned away, her eyes glistening, as if, for the first time in years, something within her had begun to stir again. Days passed in uneasy silence. Ilara went about her duties with a heavy heart, each step weighed down by fear. She replayed that stormy afternoon again and again, the rain, the queen's gaze, the stillness that followed. Perhaps she had overstepped. Perhaps her song had been an offense. Every whisper in the palace made her flinch. Every look from a servant felt like a warning. Then one morning, as sunlight poured through the tall windows, a royal messenger appeared in the servants' quarters. His voice carried authority, calm but commanding. "Ilara, maid of the lower wing," he announced. "The queen requests your presence in the royal hall." The room fell silent. Ilara's heart pounded. The other maids stared at her in disbelief. "She's in trouble," one murmured. "No maid ever gets summoned there." Trembling, Alara followed the messenger through the labyrinth of marble corridors. The echo of her footsteps mingled with the thrum of her heartbeat. When the grand doors opened before her, the sight nearly stole her breath. The royal hall stretched endlessly. Golden pillars, crystal chandeliers, and sunlight filtering through stained glass like liquid fire. At the far end sat the queen, regal and composed upon her throne. Behind her stood the court musicians, instruments poised but silent. Alara bowed deeply, her voice barely a whisper. "Your Majesty." The queen's expression was calm, almost unreadable. Then softly she spoke. Alara's lips parted. "I wish to hear your song once." "My song, Your Majesty?" The queen nodded. "The one you sang in the rain." Fear and awe tangled within her chest. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward. She closed her eyes, inhaled shakily, and began to sing. The simple melody she had once written for her mother, long ago. The first note floated through the hall, fragile, uncertain, then grew stronger, richer, filled with soul. The grand chamber, once a place of formality, transformed into something sacred. Even the courtiers who had smirked moments ago sat spellbound. Her voice rose like sunlight breaking through clouds, pure, healing, alive. When the final note faded, silence lingered. Then the queen's voice, trembling softly, broke it. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Alara lowered her gaze, tears glinting. From the silence of being unseen, whispers moved faster than the wind. By morning, the story had spread through every corridor, courtyard, and servants' hall. The queen had smiled. It had been years since anyone had seen such a thing. The courtiers who once lowered their voices in her presence now spoke with awe. "A Maid song," they said, "has awakened Her Majesty's heart." The tale shimmered with wonder, twisting through the palace like sunlight through stained glass. Even the nobles who had once giggled at the singing maid now spoke Alara's name with reverence. The royal composer, a man famed for his pride, requested an audience with her. "Her tone," he murmured, "has something no training could ever teach." Soon the queen began hosting evening gatherings, intimate and simple, nothing like the grand feasts of old. Candles burned low and the scent of jasmine drifted through the air. The court musicians would play softly, their notes weaving around Alara's voice like threads of gold. And when she sang, the entire palace seemed to breathe again. The queen would sit quietly, hands folded, her eyes glistening not with sorrow but with memory, the sweet kind that no longer hurt. Sometimes she closed her eyes and swayed ever so slightly, as though each note soothed a wound words could not reach. One evening, when Alara finished a tender lullaby, the queen rose from her throne and said softly, "Your song. It reminds me of him." No one dared ask whom she meant, but everyone knew. The child she had lost. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the palace. Servants hummed as they worked. The gardens bloomed brighter, or so it seemed. Music once again filled the halls, but now it carried something purer. The echo of hope reborn. The same nobles who once mocked Alara now bowed when she passed. They called her the Song of the Palace, but Alara remained unchanged. After each performance, she folded her shawl, thanked the musicians, and returned to her duties. The next morning, she could still be found in the same corridor, broom in hand, quietly scrubbing the marble floors. When a young servant once asked her why, she smiled gently. "Because music was never about crowns or applause," she said. "It's about hearts listening, even the ones that have forgotten how." The queen, overhearing those words from across the hall, felt her eyes fill once more, not with pain but with pride. In Alara, she saw herself, the woman she once had been before sorrow stole her voice. And in that reflection, something within her healed. Fame, even the purest kind, never comes without envy. As Alara's songs filled the palace and joy returned to the queen's heart, not everyone rejoiced. Hidden among the courtiers was Lord Cassian, the royal advisor, a man whose pride thrived on control and whose heart knew little of grace. He watched as the queen smiled at a servant's voice, as nobles bowed to a maid who once scrubbed their floors. It burned within him like quiet poison. "She is clever," he whispered to the ministers, "a girl of low birth gaining power through flattery. The queen is blinded by emotion." His words spread like smoke, curling into ears already eager for gossip. And soon, a plan was devised. A test disguised as opportunity. The Queen's Council announced that a grand banquet would be held in honor of visiting dignitaries, rulers, and nobles from distant kingdoms. There, Alara would perform before them, but there would be no royal introduction, no title, no sign of the Queen's favor. She would appear simply as she was, a servant. If her talent was true, they said, it would speak for itself. The evening arrived. The hall blazed with golden light and murmuring voices. When Alara stepped onto the stage, dressed in her plain gray gown, the guests exchanged puzzled glances. A few laughed openly. "A maid?" one scoffed. "Surely this is a jest." Alara felt the sting of their scorn, but she bowed her head and took a steady breath. Then she began to sing. The first notes trembled, soft, uncertain, then blossomed, rising with strength and sorrow. Her song told a story no words could hold, of kindness mocked, of hearts reborn, of love that endures beyond grief. The laughter died. The room fell utterly silent. Even the candles seemed to lean toward her voice. Tears shimmered on faces that had never known humility. When the final note faded, the silence turned to awe, and then thunderous applause. The foreign guests stood, hands over hearts, bowing in respect to the maid who had made them feel again. The Queen rose from her throne, her eyes bright with pride. "Let it be known," she declared, her voice ringing through the hall, "that this girl's song restored the soul of this kingdom." And in that moment, no crown shone brighter than the heart of the maid who sang. The morning after the grand performance, the palace awoke to a different kind of silence. Not the heavy stillness of sorrow, but the hushed awe that follows something miraculous. Everywhere people spoke the same name with reverence and wonder. Alara. Servants whispered it in the corridors, nobles in the courts, and even the guards by the gates. The maid who made the Queen weep. The girl whose voice healed a kingdom. In the grand throne room, sunlight streamed through tall windows, scattering gold across the floor. There, before the entire royal court, the Queen summoned Alara. Alara entered, her simple gray dress freshly pressed, her hands trembling. The maids who once mocked her now stood at the back, eyes shining with pride and apology. The Queen rose slowly from her throne, her regal figure softened by a rare, genuine smile. "Alara," she began, her voice echoing gently through the hall, "your song has touched hearts across this palace, and beyond its walls. You have given back what even gold could not buy: hope." She motioned for a royal attendant, who stepped forward holding a scroll tied with a ribbon of deep blue. "I grant you a royal scholarship to the National Conservatory," the Queen declared. "You shall study among the finest, for your voice belongs not to servitude but to the stars. Let it be known that you are the voice of grace." The hall erupted in applause. Some of the maids wiped their eyes. Others clasped their hands over their hearts. The royal composer bowed low, humbled. Overwhelmed, Alara fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Your Majesty, I sang only to be heard, not to be seen." The Queen stepped forward, gently raising her chin. "And that," she said softly, "is why the world will remember you." For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Two women, worlds apart in station but bound by the same ache, the same healing, the same love for music that transcended crowns and class. The Queen's hand rested over Alara's, and in that silent touch bloomed something eternal: forgiveness, faith, and fate woven together in the language of song. And as the bells of the palace rang outside, it was not just a victory for one maid, but the sound of a kingdom reborn through the voice of grace. The years that followed became a golden chapter in the kingdom's history, not one of conquest or wealth, but of renewal born from a song. The Queen, once known for her silence, became a patron of music once more. The palace that had once echoed with grief now rang with laughter, harps and choruses of children learning to sing. Across the city, music schools opened their doors to the poor and gifted alike, each one inspired by the story of the maid whose melody had healed a monarch's heart. At the center of the capital, a grand music hall was rebuilt, its walls carved with roses and silver vines. Above the great entrance gleamed an inscription in gold, dedicated to Alara, the maid who sang for the broken. People from every corner of the land came to see it. They spoke of the Queen's wisdom and of the girl who had reminded them that grace does not wear crowns, and that truth often sings from the humblest voices. And yet, when the crowds faded and the applause became memory, Alara remained herself, She never wore jewels, never accepted titles. She walked the palace halls just as she had years before, in simple linen, her hair tied loosely, her steps light as a whisper. Servants greeted her with smiles now, bowing not from duty but from love. Sometimes she would pause by the marble fountain in the garden, the very place where her story had begun, and listen to the wind. Then, almost unconsciously, she would hum the same melody that once defied her fear and reached a queen's heart. The sound drifted through the corridors, soft and timeless, wrapping the palace in warmth. Even after she left, that song never faded. It lived in the hearts of every maid, every noble, every child who dared to dream.